Picture this. It is the gray, frozen dawn of December 16th, 1944. Across an 85-mile stretch of the densely forested Ardennes region of eastern Belgium and Luxembourg, the earth itself seems to shake. More than 200,000 German soldiers surge forward through the darkness, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 2,600 artillery pieces, and a wall of steel, the likes of which the Western Front had not seen in months. Hitler has bet his last hand. This is Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, and the name is deliberately deceptive, chosen to make Allied intelligence believe the Germans are digging in, not punching forward. 4 American divisions, some battered and exhausted from earlier fighting, some barely trained and new to combat, hold that 85-mile line. They are thinly stretched, under strength, and in many cases still wearing summer uniforms as temperatures plunge well below freezing. They are caught almost entirely by surprise. Fog and thick cloud cover have grounded Allied air power. The Germans are pouring through the gaps in the American lines, and at the sharp tip of the spear, rolling down icy roads in the dark with the weight of small buildings and the confidence of men who believe they cannot be stopped, come the King Tigers. The battle that follows will become the largest and costliest single engagement ever fought by the United States Army. It will last 6 brutal weeks. And somewhere in those frozen forests and shattered villages, a vehicle that many American officers had mocked as a fragile stopgap, a glass cannon with an open roof, is about to change the entire psychological balance of the fight. This is the story of the M36 Tank Destroyer. And this is the story of what happens when mathematics, patience, and a gun originally designed to shoot down airplanes gets pointed at the most feared tanks in the world, the Rolling Fortress. Understanding the King Tiger, too, understand why what the M36 did in the Ardennes matters. You first have to understand what it was up against. The Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausführen B, what Allied soldiers called the King Tiger or Royal Tiger, what German crews called the Königstiger, was not simply a powerful tank. It was a philosophical statement. It represented Germany's answer to the question of what happens when you stop worrying about production numbers and decide to build something that simply cannot be killed. The King Tiger weighed in at approximately 70 tons. For context, that is heavier than many modern main battle tanks. It was powered by a 700-horsepower Maybach HL 230 V12 engine, the same engine that powered the much lighter Panther tank, which meant the King Tiger was critically underpowered for its own mass. But nobody standing in front of one tended to think about its mechanical problems first. What they thought about was the armor. The frontal hull plate was 150 millimeters thick and steeply sloped, meaning that shells didn't just have to punch through it. They had to punch through an effective armor thickness, considerably greater than the raw measurement. The turret face where the gun mantlet sat was even more formidable. The sides and rear dropped to around 80 millimeters, still thicker than many opposing vehicles carried anywhere on their hull. Allied after-action reports noted with grim frustration that the King Tiger's frontal armor was effectively immune to the standard weapons the Americans and British were fielding at combat ranges. Sherman tanks firing their 75-millimeter guns might as well have been throwing gravel. Even the standard 76-millimeter high-velocity gun that replaced the 75 on many Shermans struggled to make an impression on the King Tiger's front face at practical combat distances. Then there was the weapon system itself. The King Tiger carried the 88-millimeter KWK-43 L-71 cannon, what soldiers called the Long 88. Its muzzle velocity and accuracy at range were extraordinary. This gun could knock out any Allied tank at distances where the target was barely visible to the naked eye. German crews had reportedly scored kills at over 2,000 meters, over a mile, with consistency that made Allied tankers deeply reluctant to engage them head-on at the Battle of the Bulge. Around 150 King Tigers were committed across 4 heavy panzer battalions. Among them were the men of the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, who accompanied Kampfrupp Piper on its famous thrust toward the Meuse. and the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion, which fought extensively in the central and southern portions of the battle. These were not ordinary tank units. These were Germany's steel elite, the tip of the spear. The vehicles Hitler believed could split the Allied lines and turn the tide of the entire war in the West. And for the first days of the offensive, in the shock and chaos of a surprise attack through fog and snowstorms, they very nearly justified that confidence. Running out of answers, the American armored crisis. King Tiger's appearance in numbers presented the United States Army with a problem that had been building since the Normandy campaign 6 months earlier, and for which it had no truly satisfactory solution. Not yet. American armored doctrine before the war had been shaped by a fundamental assumption. Tanks fought infantry and fortifications. Other tanks would be handled by a new, specialized branch called the Tank Destroyer Force, which would use fast, lightly armored vehicles carrying powerful guns to ambush enemy armor from concealed positions, destroy it, and withdraw before the enemy could respond. The logic was sound on paper. You didn't need a heavily armored vehicle if the enemy couldn't hit back. You needed speed, a good gun, and the discipline to stay hidden. The vehicle that embodied this doctrine in 1944 was the M10 Wolverine, a 3-inch gun mounted on a modified Sherman chassis with an open-topped turret. In North Africa and in the early stages of the Italian campaign, the M10 had performed adequately. It could handle the tanks Germany was fielding at the time. But then came the Panther and then the Tiger I, and suddenly the 3-inch gun was obsolete. Not just inadequate, obsolete. Crews watched their rounds spark off the frontal armor of Panthers at distances where the German tank could easily fire back and destroy them. By June 1944, Eisenhower's headquarters was urgently requesting that all M10 battalions be converted to a better armed vehicle as quickly as possible. The problem was finding one. The M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked fighting vehicle in the American arsenal, capable of over 50 miles per hour on roads, carried a 76mm gun that was a genuine improvement over the 3-inch but still left crews nervous when facing Tiger-class armor. What the Army needed was something bigger, something that could genuinely kill the heaviest German tanks at distances where those German tanks couldn't kill back. The answer existed. It just barely existed in small numbers. Arriving at the front in the middle of October 1944, roughly 6 weeks before the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive. Born in a crisis, the creation of the M36. The M36 was not the product of careful long-range planning. It was the product of urgency, improvisation, and an anti-aircraft gun looking for a new purpose. American engineers had recognized as early as September 1942 that a 90mm weapon system would be needed to counter the direction German armor was heading. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun was already in service, a superb weapon designed to hurl shells at aircraft flying at high altitudes, which meant it had exceptional muzzle velocity, flat trajectory, and hitting power. Engineers mounted it on an N10 hull with a newly designed turret, and the result was the T-71 prototype, later standardized in June 1944 as the 90mm gun motor carriage M36. Production was chaotic and rushed. Many M36s were created by converting existing M10A1 South, essentially removing the old turret and welding on the new one. Others were built on Sherman M4A3 hulls when M10A1 chassis ran short, creating the variant designated M36B1. The vehicles began arriving in Europe in September 1944. By the time the Ardennes offensive opened on December 16th, fewer than 250 M36s were in combat across the entire European theater of operations. 3 Tank Destroyer Battalions, the 610th, the 703rd, and the 740th, were equipped with the type, and all 3 would find themselves deeply engaged in the fighting that followed. The gun itself was remarkable. firing its standard armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of around 2,650 feet per second. The 90mm M3 was capable of punching through 122mm of armor at 1,000 yards, enough to threaten the sides and rear of German heavy armor and, at the right angles and ranges, the turret faces as well. But the Army also had a special ammunition type in limited supply, the T3OE16HVAP round, a high-velocity armor-piercing shot with a tungsten carbide penetrating core. With HVAP ammunition, the numbers changed dramatically. That round could push through 199mm of steel at 1,000 yards and 176mm at 1,370 yards. When using HVAP, the 90mm accuracy actually rivaled, and in some tests exceeded, the legendary KWK-43 that the King Tiger carried. The Germans had designed their tank to be invulnerable to what they knew the Americans had. They had not designed it to be invulnerable to what the Americans were quietly bringing to the fight. The critical limitation was that HVAP rounds were scarce. Each one had to be used with judgment. You couldn't spray them into the distance and hope for the best. You had to know your range, know your target, and trust both your equipment and your mathematics. That discipline, the discipline of patient, precise, long-range gunnery, would define how the best M36 crews operated in the Ardennes. A coffin in the cold, the open turret. Before we talk about what the M36 could do, we need to be honest about what it was asked to endure. The open-topped turret was the M36's most distinctive and most debated feature. The Army had removed the roof to save weight and manufacturing time, and in theory, this made sense. Tank destroyers were supposed to fight from concealed positions. They weren't supposed to get into the kind of close-range brawls where artillery airbursts and thrown grenades could drop down into an uncovered fighting compartment in the Ardennes in December 1944. Though the open turret meant something else entirely. It meant 5 men stood in an uncovered metal box in temperatures that dropped to -20°C and below. A thick, freezing fog blanketed the region for the first week of the battle. Snow fell constantly. Blizzards reduced visibility to almost nothing. Allied air power was grounded entirely until the skies finally cleared around Christmas. And through all of it, M36 crews stood exposed in their open turrets, their breath fogging, their fingers threatening to fuse to the metal around them. The cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was a tactical threat. Rifles jammed in the freezing temperatures. Tanks froze to the ground overnight and had to be chiseled free before they could move. The leather-soled footwear many American soldiers were still wearing soaked through in the snow and led to rampant cases of trench foot. Thousands of American casualties during the Battle of the Bulge were not caused by German shells. They were caused by cold. And tank destroyer crews in their open turrets were among the most exposed men in the American order of battle. Crews improvised everything they could. Extra clothing, blankets, newspapers stuffed into boots. They rotated positions to let men cycle through the hull where the engine offered faint warmth. They moved constantly just to keep blood circulating. And they did all of this while maintaining watch on terrain they could barely see through swirling snow and fog, waiting for the distinctive angular silhouette of German armor to emerge from the white. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the M36 units most deeply engaged during the Bulge, had converted from M10s to M36s only in late September 1944, less than 3 months before the German offensive began. They had barely had time to learn the new vehicle's characteristics before they were sent into some of the hardest fighting of the entire campaign, positioned along Elsenborn Ridge in the northern blocking shoulder of the battle, where they helped hold a line that the Germans desperately needed to break through. The mathematics of murder, range, and the art of disappearing. What made the M36 dangerous was not just its gun. Any gun is only as useful as the crew behind it understands ballistics, range, and concealment. The M36's most effective crews learned to fight like snipers, patient, invisible, and lethal at distances their opponents hadn't planned for. The tactical advantage was elegantly simple. The King Tiger's 88mm gun was extraordinary at ranges of 800 to 1,200 yards. At those distances, German crews could hit with consistency that was genuinely frightening. But push the engagement out to 2,000 yards or beyond, and the mathematics changed. Long-range gunnery requires accounting for a shell's drop over distance, wind, drift, temperature effects on propellant charges, and target movement. At 2,000 yards, even the best German crews were working hard. At 2,500 yards, they were essentially guessing. The 90mm M3 gun, when loaded with HVAP ammunition and operated by a crew that knew what they were doing, could reach out to those extreme distances with genuine effectiveness. And crucially, at those ranges, the M36 was nearly invisible. The vehicle had a relatively low profile compared to many of the tanks it was hunting. Positioned in the shadows of tree lines, nestled behind ridges with only the turret exposed, or hidden in burned-out structures where its olive-drab paint blended into rubble and shadow, the M36 could sit motionless for hours, watching, waiting, letting the enemy come to it. The tactic was the opposite of the aggressive, charging German panzer doctrine. It was slow, methodical, and deeply unglamorous. A tank destroyer crew would identify a good firing position before dawn, move into it before full light, and then simply wait. Through binoculars, they watched for movement on roads and at crossroads. They watched for the telltale dust or exhaust smoke of an armored column approaching. They calculated ranges from prominent landmarks that they had already measured or estimated. And when a target finally entered the kill zone they had selected, they fired, usually once or twice, and then displaced before the enemy could locate them. One documented long-range kill from the Ardennes campaign involved a crew from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion managing to destroy a Panther at approximately 4,600 yards, roughly 2.6 miles, the absolute maximum range of the M36's telescopic sight. Another documented engagement saw an M36 from the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion knock out a King Tiger at 1,000 yards with a well-placed shot to the side of the turret, precisely where the armor was thin enough for even standard AP rounds to get through. These were not flukes. They were the product of crews who had mastered their weapons' capabilities and learned to exploit the geometry of engagement, ranges their opponents hadn't considered, the ghost battalions, and 36s at the Battle of the Bulge, when the German offensive opened on December 16th. The three M36 battalions in the Ardennes found themselves in an immediate crisis. The 610th, 703rd, and 740th were suddenly the only American weapons consistently capable of dealing with the German armor pouring through the broken front lines. At St. Vith, critical road junction that the German timetable required to be captured by 6 in the evening on December 17th, M36 tank destroyers played a central role in one of the most heroic delays of the entire battle. The German plan was to push through and exploit the breakthrough within days. Instead, they faced a mobile defense that kept St. Vith in American hands until December 21st, 4 days beyond the German schedule, and that delay, imposed on a force that vastly outnumbered the defenders, proved significant to the entire campaign. After-action reports from the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion were blunt about what made the difference. The entire situation proved conclusively that the fundamentals of many tank destroyer doctrines are well-founded. They wrote, "The advantages of a highly mobile reserve were brought out in the ability of the reserve units to take favorable positions in depth and move quickly to threatened areas." German General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, later said that in the St. Vith area he believed he was facing a corps-sized force, a massive, well-organized defensive formation. In reality, he was engaging a thin, improvised line of tank destroyers, tanks, infantry, and engineers doing everything possible to buy time, what the M36 provided that no other American vehicle could match. was the ability to engage King Tigers and Panthers from positions. Those vehicles couldn't threaten back. A Sherman could not do this. An M10 could not do this. But an M36, positioned correctly at 1,800 to 2,500 yards, with HVAP rounds and a disciplined crew, could put the King Tiger's crew in genuine danger while sitting in a position the Germans' own gun couldn't effectively engage. At Bastogne, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with a lighter M18 Hellcat, performed extraordinary work alongside the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. 4 M18s at Novel, just north of Bastogne, along with some Shermans and infantry from the 10th Armored Division, stopped a German armored attack cold, destroying 30 Panthers and Tigers. But it was a 90mm gun of the M36 that gave American commanders real confidence when German heavy armor was in the vicinity. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, American tank destroyers had recorded the destruction of approximately 306 German tanks during the campaign. The M36-equipped battalions were responsible for a substantial portion of those kills, and the weapon's influence on the battle went far beyond the raw numbers. The psychological collapse. When confidence became fear, something happened to German tank crews during the Ardennes campaign that the raw casualty statistics don't fully capture. Something that may have mattered just as much as the physical losses. In the early days of the offensive, King Tiger commanders had moved with the confidence that comes from believing yourself invulnerable. They stood in their cupolas as their tanks rolled down frozen roads, scanning ahead through their periscopes with an almost casual arrogance. They had good reason for it. The Allied weapons they had faced for most of 1944 couldn't touch them frontally, and they knew it. German tactical doctrine assumed engagement ranges of 800 to 1,200 yards, where their gun could destroy anything the Americans fielded, and their armor could laugh off anything the Americans fired back. Then they started dying without warning, from directions they couldn't pinpoint, at distances they hadn't expected to be dangerous. A King Tiger burning in the road, its turret blown sideways, and the crew of the next tank in column frantically scanning every tree line and ridge, finding nothing, and then finding nothing more as their own vehicle shuddered and died. The M36 crews operating at extreme ranges were almost never identified by their targets before those targets were destroyed. The attackers were essentially invisible. Their muzzle blast was masked by distance, snow, and terrain. Their low profiles blended into the winter landscape. The only evidence of their existence was the smoking wreck they left behind. Word spread through German armored units. Something was killing King Tigers at distances that German doctrine said were impossible. Whatever it was, it could sit outside the effective range of the King Tiger's own gun and pick them apart at leisure. Tank commanders who had been standing proudly in their cupolas, the mark of confidence and aggressive intent, began buttoning up, closing their hatches, sacrificing the visibility they needed to navigate the complex Ardennes terrain in exchange for the psychological comfort of feeling protected. That loss of visibility cost them tactically. The fear that produced it cost them psychologically. And the combination cost them the kind of aggressive momentum that the entire offensive depended on. The forgotten weapon. What history chose to remember the Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. The German offensive had failed to reach the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. The Wehrmacht had expended the last of its strategic armored reserves. It had lost approximately 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with the bulk of the precious tanks it could no longer replace. Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge broke the back of the Panzerwaffe in the West, and within 4 months, the war in Europe was over. Post-war analysis of the battle tended to focus on the grand strategic narrative. Patton's extraordinary 90-degree pivot and drive to relieve Bastogne, the heroic stand of the 101st Airborne, the numerical superiority of American manpower and industrial production, the catastrophic German fuel shortages that stranded King Tigers by the roadsides when their tanks simply ran dry. These were all real and important factors. The tank destroyer doctrine itself was quietly abandoned after the war. The M36 and its siblings had proven that a specialized anti-tank vehicle concept could work tactically. But the battlefield reality was that tank destroyers were being used for everything: direct fire support, infantry accompaniment, siege work against fortifications, not the doctrine-pure role of hunting enemy armor in reserve. The post-war American military concluded that what was needed was a main battle tank that combined the firepower of the M36 with the protection of a proper armored vehicle. The M26 Pershing, already arriving in Europe in small numbers by early 1945 with its own 90mm gun, pointed toward that future. The dedicated tank destroyer branch was abolished. The M36 itself had a remarkably long subsequent life. It served in the Korean War, where it proved capable of destroying every Soviet-made armored vehicle the North Koreans fielded. Around 400 vehicles went to Yugoslavia, where they were eventually fitted with more powerful engines, and served in the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s. South Korea operated them through 1959. The Republic of China Army kept at least 2 running until 2001. A vehicle designed in 1942 as an emergency stopgap, built on a converted chassis with an open roof that left its crew exposed to weather and enemy fire alike, managed to outlast the doctrine that created it by half a century. But in the histories of the Battle of the Bulge, the M36 barely appears. The crews who froze in those open turrets, who calculated ballistic trajectories in their heads while their fingers went numb, who held the line at St. Vith and Elsenborn Ridge and dozens of nameless crossroads while King Tigers burned in the distance. They came home mostly without decorations or recognition. Their weapon had no glamour. It looked improvised because it was improvised, and it won its victories through patience and mathematics rather than through the kind of dramatic, visible heroism that makes for a satisfying story. The lesson that wasn't written down here is what the story of the M36 in the Ardennes actually tells us. If we're willing to pay attention, the King Tiger was, by nearly every conventional metric, an astounding machine. Its armor in certain configurations and against certain weapons was genuinely close to invulnerable. Its gun was one of the most effective anti-tank weapons of the entire war. The men who crewed it were trained, experienced, and often ferociously brave. On paper, the King Tiger should have dominated any engagement it entered, but war is not conducted on paper. War is conducted in forests and river valleys, on icy roads, in temperatures that freeze equipment and exhaust men, at ranges the designers never tested and under conditions the doctrine writers never imagined. The King Tiger's armor was invulnerable to what it had been designed to face. It was not invulnerable to what it actually faced, a weapon system its designers hadn't modeled, operated by crews who had learned to exploit the geometry of long-range gunnery in ways that the German tactical doctrine hadn't anticipated. Approximately 150 King Tigers were present in the Ardennes, nearly a third of total German production of the type. Most were lost over the course of the offensive, some to mechanical breakdown, some to fuel starvation, some to Allied air attack when the skies finally cleared. But a significant number fell to the 90mm guns of American tank destroyers, vehicles that the German commanders hadn't properly identified as a threat, operating at ranges the Germans hadn't expected to be dangerous, with ammunition types the Germans didn't know existed in American hands. Invincibility is always conditional. It depends on a specific set of assumptions about what the enemy has, what the enemy knows, and how the enemy chooses to fight. The moment those assumptions change, the invincibility evaporates. The M36 didn't beat the King Tiger through overwhelming force or superior armor. It beat the King Tiger by refusing to fight the battle the King Tiger's designers had prepared it for. It went somewhere colder, quieter, and further away than German doctrine expected, and waited. Asterisk a final word on the men who served, the men who crewed. M36 tank destroyers in the Ardennes are almost entirely forgotten today. The vehicles they operated have been overshadowed in popular memory by the Sherman and the Tiger, by the dramatic stories of famous units and famous battles. The quiet, grinding work of long-range gunnery in freezing darkness doesn't make for the same kind of story as a heroic charge or a last stand, but those men held the line. They froze in open turrets on some of the coldest nights of the war. They calculated mathematics with numb fingers and burning eyes. They destroyed tanks that the rest of the American army had been taught to fear and avoid. And they did it with a vehicle that had been mocked as a stopgap, criticized as too slow, and described as a glass cannon waiting to be smashed. The glass cannon turned out to be the only thing in the American arsenal that could consistently reach out 2 miles through frozen air and put a 90mm shell through armor that everyone else said was impenetrable. Sometimes the weapon that looks like a stopgap is exactly what the moment requires. And sometimes the men standing in the cold, doing the unglamorous mathematical work of destruction, are precisely the ones holding history together. If this story of frozen persistence and mathematical precision hit you as hard as it hit me, smash that like button right now and share it with someone who needs to know this history. Every view and every like tells the algorithm that the men in those open turrets deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to World War II. Explained if you haven't already. We cover the stories that the famous histories leave out. The weapons and the people and the moments that shaped the war from the shadows. Next week, we're going deeper into another overlooked corner of World War II that completely changed how the war was fought. Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, if you were in that open turret at -20, in the dark watching German armor roll toward you, would you have trusted the mathematics? Would you have held position? Let me know. I read every single one, and I want to hear from you.